So let's move on to the internet weather, and we have a couple of things to look at, but nothing super major in terms of troubling findings, or at least not new troubling findings. In terms of the top most probe ports, these are the ports that get scanned the most, irrespective of how many people are doing it, just in sheer volume, how many scans are against these particular ports. Port 80 TCP is at the #1 position. It moved up 6 positions. We'll take a look at that and why that is in a slide in a bit here. 135 TCP, which is your NetBIOS file sharing kind of thing. I forget exactly what, it's an older protocol. I don't think we really use it anymore. We talked about this as well. There's been some increased scanning on this again. I keep meaning to go look at our honeypots to see if I've captured any of that, and I never remember to go do that, but hopefully next week I will. In the past, when we had seen it, it was trying to use like a very typical password or something and just try to hit everybody. I guess probably just trying to see if anybody responded with that typical NetBIOS password in order to get into it. But in any event, we'll try to dig that up again. 23 TCP Telnet, that's been static at the 3rd position in the list. That's, again, your IoT devices, or in general, it's a lot of these Internet of Things devices that get compromised, usually via port 23 TCP, Telnet, and then they start scanning for more of these so that they can build their botnet up even bigger. 22 TCP, which is SSH, again, similar. There's a lot of actors out there scanning for this so that they'll deploy malware on there as well. There's a lot of IoT devices that listen on SSH as well, but as well as Linux machines just in general that do. 443 TCP is your HTTPS. That could just be for scanning to find servers that are supporting that. Could be Heartbleed scanning, could be all these other various vulnerabilities that have been talked about in the wild lately. 8080 TCP, that's usually proxy scanning, although I always remind people Tomcat's on that port, and we know that there's certain actor sets out there that like to scan for Tomcat and weak default passwords on your Tomcat administrative port, which is what that is. So secure it if you have that exposed to the internet. 445 TCP is your SMB. There's various worms that scan on that. 1433 TCP is your Microsoft SQL Server. That's moved up 5 positions. I actually pulled a chart on that, but it's not that interesting. Even though it moved up 5 positions, it's really not that much more volume than it was at position 13 last week. So it doesn't really show any large movement, even though it did move up quite a few positions there. 1900 UDP, which we've been talking about a lot, is your Simple Service Discovery Protocol, SSDP. We're seeing a lot of reflection activity with that, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about reflection in a slide in the future here, a couple of slides down the pike here. So keep that in mind when we get to that point. And then the ICMP echo requests are probably just background noise. We see lots of ICMP in general. So the 80 TCP, the area that I kind of wanted to point out that is the increase here is what's under this red bar that I kind of highlighted here. And you can kind of see that excluding this big, huge thing, so this big, huge thing back in the middle of May or early to mid-May timeframe, we talked about this. This was actually a denial of service attack against a Chinese gaming company on 80 TCP, where they actually were flooding like a /22 that they might have owned or something like that. So it was a pretty wide address space that they owned all of, and whoever was attacking them for whatever reason was hitting every IP. Instead of just trying to hit like a single IP that is at their address space, they're basically just trying to flood their router that's going to handle all of that traffic. So that's what this big lump is in here. This is actually attack traffic, not scanning traffic. But because they were trying to hit so many sources, in our data it looks like scanning traffic, because that's kind of how we differentiate scanning from an attack. Usually attacks in our data here is more to a single point. When it looks like somebody's trying to send SYN packets to a bunch of different addresses, that's what kind of flags it in our system as a scan source. And we're actually going to talk about that in an upcoming slide that's really confusing. That will be interesting. So in terms of who's doing this recent stuff over the past week or so here under this red bar, it's actually a small number of sources. There's a US web hosting provider that's accounting for a large portion of it. as well as a couple of IP addresses in China and the Czech Republic. You know, what they're up to, I'm not quite sure. They're probably just scanning for port 80 for various reasons, you know, trying to identify machines that are listening on that. It could be that they're looking for your Internet of Things devices that have web administrative ports on port 80, which there are quite a few that have that. So that's one possibility of what might be scanning beyond just regular web servers. So here's the most sources probing. So this is kind of coordinated activity. This means that somebody told a bunch of devices to start scanning on these ports. And this usually is some kind of indicator of botnet activity or something otherwise. Not surprising, 23TCP Telnet is at the #1 position. That's your IoT things. And it's actually a very large slice of the pie. We've talked about this before. I probably should have pulled a chart for this. I didn't get a chance to do that, but I would say this is maybe 30%. I don't know. It's definitely greater than 25%, right? Of all scanning activity in total is accounting for telnet traffic. 445 TCP, which we've already discussed. You've got some ICMP stuff, which I'm just going to ignore because a lot of this is either echo requests or port unreachable backscatter type stuff. 27015 UDP is your Valve Half-Life gaming server. This just manifests to kind of look like scanning activity, but in reality it's not. This is an anomaly that's not really a security issue. 17788 UDP is that PP stream protocol, which we're not entirely sure what's up with that, but it looks like a peer-to-peer kind of video streaming protocol, possibly used for Chinese video type things. I'm not quite sure because it looks like a lot of the actors are in China that are utilizing this protocol, but you know, that's the only association we have so far until we actually see some real traffic there. And as we always mention, if you watch the show and you have some more insight about some of this stuff that we talk about, please let us know. I'll give you our email address at the end of the show. The real interesting one here, and I think this is the winner for in terms of most improved, although I really don't want something to improve here, but 80 UDP moved up 86 positions. That's huge, right? So we've never seen anything move up 86 positions. But the reality of the situation here is this is erroneous. It's not really scanning traffic, and I'm going to explain that in a second, although I wish I had a better picture. But let's just take a quick look at what it looks like. So you kind of see here on the 80 UDP, and even though it's labeled HTTP, the well-known IANA service for HTTP, or 80 UDP is HTTP, but nobody really uses HTTP over UDP, although I will say Google has an experimental service that they're toying with to have HTTP run over port 80 UDP, but that's not what this is. In any event, you can see that yesterday and the day before we had some 10,000, 7,000 scan sources all in unison trying to scan on port 80 UDP. If you're actually to look at that traffic, what it really is not scanning activity at all. It was SNMP reflection activity. So we talked about SSDP, port 1900 UDP, being a potential reflection. And we talked last week about this. I kind of described, so if I'm a bad actor, I can forge a packet. So let's say Matt is my target. And his IP address is mattkaiser@att.com.
That's an IP address, John.
That's not an IP address. But so when I create the packet, I put Matt's IP address as the source of my, my packet, and the destination is to a SNMP, in this case, an SNMP reflection device. So I have a list of all these devices out on the internet that I know that will answer an SNMP query. And since it's UDP, which is connectionless, I can create a packet, put a source IP of Matt's in there, I put a destination IP of the SNMP reflection, and I ask it a tiny little question. I say, hey, you know, SNMP device out there, what is your, give me your entire SNMP state table. And when I do that, I make the source port also of my request to port 80. So source IP Matt, source port 80, destination port of the SNMP guy, destination port, destination IP of the guy, destination port 161. Probably going too long on this. In any event, that packet goes out to the guy, the SNMP reflection, and then he reflects it back to Matt. But when he does, he's going to send a lot of data. So my request is small. The amount of data that comes back to Matt is gigantic. So it's kind of, I like to say, it's akin to me sending a catalog or a little card to Sears Roebuck saying, please send me your catalog, and then they send a giant catalog to Matt instead. So what they do, what's happening here is exactly what I described there. But instead of targeting one person for whatever reason, I don't know, this particular actor was up to a bunch of shenanigans. So they were spraying packets at the S&MP reflectors with all kinds of source IPs, fake source IPs, that were going all backscattering all across the internet. So to us, that looks like you got these S&MP reflectors out there trying to scan on port 80 UDP, which is how this manifests in this chart. Long story to get to the ultimate endpoint, but it's not a real issue in terms of this is mostly attack traffic, not really scanning traffic looking for people listening on port 80 UDP. Enough said about that. I wish I had a better picture to show you DNS reflection activity and how it works, but I think we have in the previous shows, so we could probably dig that up.